So as you can see from the slide, my talk is entitled Henri Nouwen and Same-Sex Attraction, the Therapeutic Turn in Dutch Catholicism. So my work, my thesis, is very much a deliberate attempt at constructing a missing and important part of LGBTIQ history, particularly as it pertains to the Catholic Church and the part Dutch Catholic priest Henri Nouwen played within it. A story which has remained largely silent or buried in the ecclesiastical world, I believe largely dominated by homophobia, patriarchy, and heteronormativity. Now, as a method of research, it was necessary to view the extensive archival material left by Nouwen, housed at the University of Toronto, through what is best described as a queer lens. By this, I do not mean that I am cruising the archival record with the sole purpose of finding artifacts of a queer past. It is a task much more than that. To queer an archive is to be political and subversive. This project sets out instead to recast history, to challenge and undermine the distortions and omissions of previously accepted historical narratives. As a verb, to queer is a performative action, transforming accepted norms. And of course, it can be discomforting, provocative, and challenging, something I hope my dissertation will achieve. Henri Nouwen was an internationally renowned author and university professor, and a man who struggled with his own same-sex attraction. During his lifetime, he authored 39 books on the spiritual life. Nouwen was born in the Netherlands in 1932, was ordained in Utrecht Cathedral in 1957, and died in Canada in 1996. He died 25 years ago to the day yesterday, and the Henri Nouwen Society had an online celebration to mark this event. Directly after his ordination, Nouwen studied psychology at the Catholic University of Nijmegen. Nouwen immersed himself completely in psychology because he felt instinctively that this social science discipline dealt with issues that were of the utmost importance for the Church and its pastoral theology. Nouwen's interest in psychology was representative of a trend which arose in post-war Western society towards a psychotherapeutic discourse in order to solve the many problems its citizens faced. And scholars refer to this phenomenon as the therapeutic turn, promoted in the Netherlands of the 1950s and 60s by a group of Dutch Catholic intellectuals, all leaders in the Dutch Catholic Mental Health Association. This movement increasingly turned to a psychoanalytical understanding of the human psyche, and its findings were endorsed by the Dutch Catholic Episcopate. And it was within this new paradigm that Nouwen situated his research and pastoral response to homosexuality. As Nouwen began his studies in psychology, the Netherlands witnessed a changing attitude towards homosexual men and women. This is particularly evident with the establishment of the Pastoral Bureau in Amsterdam, opened from 1958 to 1965, staffed by a number of Catholic clergymen, Catholic psychiatrists, and a Catholic moral theologian. Its work was specifically designed to offer pastoral support for men and women experiencing problems associated with a homosexual orientation, using the therapeutic insights of the Dutch Catholic Mental Health Association. It received client referrals from both the COC, a secular organization promoting gay and lesbian emancipation, and parish clergy, who were both noting that many Catholic homosexuals were suffering from moral conflict and needed mental health support. Its founding was also a response to criticisms from the Dutch gay and lesbian community that the Catholic Church showed little concern for their situation and predicament. As a result, under the leadership of Kees Trimbos, a social psychiatrist who led the Pastoral Bureau, a shift occurred in the way that pastoral care was offered to Catholic homosexual men and women, one which took a decidedly therapeutic approach. A greater emphasis was placed on the inner life, where personal conscience and individual responsibility became the higher ideal. This involved, perhaps surprisingly from our modern viewpoint, a redefinition of Catholic norms and values. With their ideas about a livable morality and a personal individual way of believing, the Pastoral Bureau emphasized values based on Christian humanist principles, such as charity, humanity, understanding, and openness. In the interests of mental health, this meant Catholic homosexuals were called not to observe a strict moral code, but to observe psychologically higher standards. And this involved a mature personality where one accepted a homosexual orientation in a meaningful and responsible way. The findings of the Pastoral Bureau was presented to the Catholic Episcopate at the end of their research period when the Bureau closed in 1964, I think it was. For the Catholic homosexuals, mental health was now the driving force behind pastoral provision. And in particular, lessons from this therapeutic turn in Dutch Catholicism are reflected in one of Nouwen's earliest published essays, entitled The Self-Availability of the Homosexual, found in a book, a little-known book, edited by W. Dwight Oberheitzer, entitled Is Gay Good? But notice the question mark, published in 1971. And this year marks the 50th anniversary of the publication of this book. This essay within the book represents a pioneering effort on the part of a Catholic priest to deal with the subject of homosexuality in a life-affirming and positive light. In this essay, Nouwen poses an important ethical, psychological, and pastoral question. How can people who possess a same-sex attraction make their sexual orientation available to themselves so that they can meaningfully relate to it? Remember, it was written in 1971, an era when coming out, both to oneself and others, was very difficult for most in society. Nouwen's expression availability, which appears in the title of the essay, appears to be an English translation of the French word disponibiliteit, a term found among the writings of the Dutch Catholic mental health movement. In 1952, the Flemish Jesuit André Snoek described disponibiliteit as a state of being for mental health, and innerlijke disponibiliteit, if I have my Dutch pronunciation correct. It was a Flemicizing of the term disponibiliteit, by which a person must imagine their lives in a balance, must imagine in their lives balance, resistance, flexibility, adaptability, resilience, and above all, openness. According to Snoek, a mentally healthy person is someone who can easily connect with their fellow human beings within their own sphere of life. That is, someone in control of their spiritual health and inner freedom. Thus, for Snoek, the concept of innerlijke disponibiliteit and inner freedom were closely linked. In the 1940s, Frederik Buitendijk, a leading figure in the Dutch Catholic Mental Health Association and one of Nouwen's professors at Nijmegen, had noted that many Catholics appeared spiritually unhealthy due to what he called a lack of inner freedom. By 1955, a priest-psychologist, Hun Fortman, another leading figure in the same association and a mentor of Nouwen's and one of his professors, said that these ideas, innerlijke disponibiliteit and inner freedom, were a useful working definition for Catholic pastoral practice. He considered that these concepts underlied everything. For Fortman, a healthy life of faith involved doing away with restrictions involving a narrow moralism and misunderstood religious beliefs. This became, in Fortman's words, the new assignment for Catholic mental health caregivers. For Nouwen, it seems, this new assignment was applied pastorally to same-sex attracted persons. Now, the concept of disponibiliteit and Nouwen's expression availability and Snook's expression innerlijke disponibiliteit is undoubtedly linked to the same philosophical concept conceived by Gabriel Marcel, a French existentialist whose influence is found extensively in the writings of the Dutch Catholic mental health movement. Born in 1889, Marcel was a graduate of the Sorbonne, converted to Catholicism in 1929, and authorized 12 books and 30 plays before his death in 1973. For Marcel, disponibiliteit is best described as an attitude or an intent, a general disposition which involves us in the social and spiritual dimensions of our lives. As an attitude, it is also a turning towards something, a direction we take, or even a way in which our face is turned. It refers to the extent to which one is available to someone, or that state of having one's resources at hand to offer, such resources being material, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. So returning to Nouwen and his essay, we find that Nouwen has applied this concept of disponibiliteit or innerlijke disponibiliteit psychotherapeutically to same-sex attracted people. He chose the English words availability or self-availability as pragmatic translations of these French and Dutch terms. But I would argue that the English word openness or inner openness might have represented a better choice of words. Nonetheless, availability and self-availability are offered by Nouwen as a way for people to relate meaningfully to their sexual orientation. Nouwen believed emphatically that people could not deny their most essential self without great harm, whether heterosexual or same-sex attracted, and one's sexuality touches the very core of one's internal life. And importantly, the person who denies their sexual orientation is described by Nouwen as a person who pretends to be able to live without a heart. However, he said, when one's sexuality is made available to oneself and is recognized as belonging to the center of one's life, then a person will find themselves in a situation where they can relate to it on a realistic basis and is able to make a moral decision about the way of life they want to live. In other words, we all need to accept this aspect of our humanity if we are to lead authentic, whole, and honest lives. In order to grasp this concept of disponibiliteit more fully, it is also helpful to look at its opposite, undisponibiliteit or unavailability. In his 1971 essay, Nouwen also wrote about the dangers inherent when one is unavailable to one's sexual orientation. And to quote him, he said, "How can you relate to a reality that is not available to you?" And to highlight this, Nouwen turned to Dutch Catholic psychiatrist W.G. Sengers, who was one of the first psychiatrists in the world to argue, backed by his extensive phenomenological research, that there was little evidence homosexuality could be cured, believing self-acceptance was the only way a homosexual person could maintain mental health. Sengers wrote this in 1968 when he published his thesis. And Nouwen quotes Sengers directly in his essay. And this is the quote: "I have to stress the fact," Sengers says, "that people whose lives are lived in resistance are convinced of the positive value of this attitude, but the price they pay is very high. There is an increasing tension, internal as well as in every relationship to the other. The sexual life cannot form a unity with the rest of the personality. It has become a hostile part, which through its increasing power becomes a disturbing reality. Every form of social life remains superficial, which causes life to become increasingly distorted and narrow." Now, Marcel too reflected upon the ways disponibiliteit or unavailability may manifest itself in a person's life. And Marcel wrote, "To be unavailable is to be in some manner encumbered by the self. Everything shows us that a being lives less, or if you wish, in a more needy way, the more one is encumbered with oneself or entangled in oneself. This type of encumbrance becomes crippling, leads to a life of impoverishment, and is in the long term unsupportable." Crispation was another way Marcel believed indisponibiliteit may manifest itself in a person's life. Crispation is a technical term more common in French than in English, which describes a shriveling and contraction, a hardening of the heart, which are consequent upon a withdrawal into the self. So to finish, the therapeutic turn in pastoral care adopted by the Dutch Catholic Church in the 1950s and 60s offered Nouwen the means to explore his pastoral response to same-sex attracted men and women. Now, this remains very much an untold story, especially in the English-speaking world, a forgotten or perhaps airbrushed part of the Catholic Church's history. Within some quarters of the Catholic Church, this story may seem discomforting, provocative, and even challenging. For others, such as same-sex attracted Catholic men and women, or anyone of faith really, hearing this story for the first time could be quite liberating. Although much of my thesis tells the story of something which happened in the past, it remains an ongoing story, one which highlights mental health issues which exist today. These issues are still found among same-sex attracted men and women, especially among those who wish to remain within the Catholic fold, despite an institution which continues to describe their sexual orientation as intrinsically disordered and the physical expression of their sexual orientation as acts of grave depravity. And also states, as you see at the bottom, under no circumstances can they be approved. I think it is a story as relevant today as it was in 1971, 50 years ago, when Henri Nouwen first tackled this issue. So thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Philip. So we'll hand it over to Ika now for the response.
Awesome. Thank you, Guy. And thank you very much, Philip, for this fascinating and really kind of beautiful paper. Can you stop sharing your screen now, perhaps? That's the hard bit. It's up at the top somewhere.
Is it?
Is it? Or is it down at the bottom?
Let me see. I don't know about technology, I'm afraid. Stop sharing. There it is.
Beautiful.
There we are. Right.
So thank you again for this amazing paper, which excavates a forgotten moment, as you say, in the history of the Catholic Church, and a not very well known moment in queer history. And I think it tries in a way to make this moment available to us. And this is perhaps a question that you might like to respond to in a moment. Is this notion of availability perhaps a useful one for thinking about what you yourself are doing in trying to make the work of Henri Nouwen available to us now? So I want to make two kind of brief responses in the 5 minutes that I have to speak. One is historical and one is kind of more social or cultural, I guess. So historically, I think I see your work as animated by a particular kind of queer impulse, which has been written about in a few places lately. And this is a kind of a desire to rescue, in a way, queer moments from the past. And Walter Benjamin talks about the impulse to rescue things from the kind of the catastrophe of history, that the angel of history wants to go back and repair the things that have been broken. And this notion of kind of rescuing a possibility or a moment from the past has been described as the queer touch across time by the queer medieval scholar Carolyn Dinshaw. And recently the classicist Sebastian Metzner has called it queer unhistoricism. So it's a kind of uncanny recognition, which is a moment of kind of, I am queer, this moment is queer, we see each other across time, but it's also a moment which unsettles temporal boundaries and orders, not just gendered ones. So as you say in that work of queering the archive, you're not just going through the past looking for something which is the same, which is kind of already recognizable as the same kind of queerness as one might experience now. But in that work of queering, you're actually unsettling archival structures and also kind of temporal orders in itself. And I think particularly this is something I see a lot at the moment, is this notion of a very kind of smooth and ordered progress in a particular direction. I see kind of students going, oh, of course, you know, there weren't any lesbians in the 1990s. That was long ago and it was all terrible. And I'm like, that is not how I remember the 1990s. That is strange. Right. And you know, my partner wrote the first young adult novel with a gay protagonist in Australia, but we still see people kind of going, this is the first, this must be the first. So this kind of forgetting of history in the name of a kind of progress. And I think these kind of rescue projects of other forms of queerness or other moments of other ways of understanding queerness in the past are a really important way that we disorder and queer that historical ordering itself. I also think about, at the same time as this kind of insistence that everything was terrible and queerness has only just started existing kind of post social media, I think we also see another impulse kind of happening simultaneously, which is a almost nostalgic queer return to the mid 20th century. So the kind of pre and post Stonewall era. So the drag houses of New York suddenly becoming a Netflix series in Pose, etc. So there's a kind of sense of a recent past, and I've talked about the medievalist Carolyn Dinshaw and the classicist Sebastian Metzner, who are looking, you know, across centuries with this queer touch across time. But there is also a kind of pull towards a more recent past, which is littered with unrealized queer utopias and with certain queer styles, which we might resonate with more than the ones that are associated with our own time period. And Elizabeth Freeman has called this a kind of temporal drag, a particular kind of, she writes about kind of lesbians' investment in either a kind of 1950s butch femme lesbian bar scene style or a kind of 1970s Birkenstocks and picnic and kind of bad vegetarian food sort of lesbian style. And he says that there is this kind of drag back into a kind of previous generation. And more recently, Alexis Lothian has written a book about this. And this is, I guess, my first question for you to respond to. And she's writing about kind of queer activism in the sort of 80s and 90s, so a very recent past, but saying that she still has this kind of sense that there is an unfinished project there that is still accessible to us and still available, and we still need it now. And these are resources for a kind of queer self-making in the present, or even across a boundary between present and past. So we recognize ourselves in this kind of historically distributed community. We're not just in this moment now, we actually find a community across time. And we also find in that time available certain resources that we might need for the present. And this idea of community is at the center of the other response that I want to make, which will be very fast because I see I'm already at my 5 minutes. And this one is framed more as a question, I guess. So it seems to me that when we take this therapeutic approach to homosexuality or same-sex attraction, the focus is on the self, on the psyche, and on the soul. So the writers, so it's about making one's sexual orientation available to oneself and this kind of inner reorganization of one's self and one's inner resources in a way. But I noticed that you also talked about disponibiliteit or availability as being available to someone. And this idea that if you're not available to yourself, you're not available to others, you're not able to connect meaningfully out and kind of become part of a kind of broader life. So I'm thinking about this as kind of a current that runs along in the 60s and 70s in parallel with the kind of broader, outside of Catholicism, turn towards the notion of queerness as community, so collective political actions, pride marches, etc. A broader sense of a kind of the kind of nascent idea of queerness as a group of people who have something in common. So I'm wondering if this approach makes the queer Catholic, to whom does the queer Catholic or the same-sex attracted Catholic or the Catholic homosexual, to whom do they become available? Do they become available to God? Do they become available to the church? Do they become available to the broader gay community or the queer community? So it's a slightly clumsy way of asking it, but I think, but it's about where, is there, I suppose another way of saying that is there also a politics there? And how does this go along perhaps with a project that you talked about of questioning Catholic norms and values? And that is where I will stop. But and again, thank you. I found this really, really fascinating and useful.
Right. Well, thank you for that reply. It's interesting that I think Nouwen in his essay did not tease out the issue as well as perhaps you just expressed it, but Marcel, who was the first to devise this concept of disponibiliteit, he described it as a human virtue. And he was a philosopher, but he said that disponibiliteit was something which appears to be not so much an inner availability, but an availability always directed towards the other. So I use the term turning towards the other. And he did talk about disponibiliteit towards oneself, but in the context of it can only occur when you turn towards the other. So by being available to the other, you become available to yourself. It was a reciprocal arrangement. And I think my project would be that I would ask the church that this is a debate which, in many respects, within most Christian circles, has come to a stalemate between two factions. One which queer Christians are saying that they have a rightful place in the church, and the other part of the church saying, no, you don't, or if you do, you have to be celibate and you must not enter into a same-sex relationship. You know, the idea of, what is it, love, hate the sin, love the sinner, which we hear all the time. So I think that this concept of disponibiliteit, if I was to apply it to the modern situation, I would be asking the church to be disponible to the queer community, just as the queer community needs to be disponible to the church. So it's a two-way concept, a two-way, both need to acquire the virtue to have a conversation, It is not just enough for the queer community to say we're going to be, we're here, we're queer, the old line. It also requires the church to acknowledge that same disponibiliteit towards the queer community within its midst, people of faith who wish to be part of the church. It also applies to people of faith of other religious traditions as well. You can apply it there too. So this is something the church, I think, needs to learn, because if you look at the Catechism, my last slide, of course, describing people as intrinsically disordered and what they do in their bedrooms, in their relationships as what's the other thing, acts of grave depravity, is not displaying much disponibiliteit, is it? Mm. And making a statement under no circumstances can they be approved is closing off any sense of availability. That is not to say there aren't people within the church who are showing some availability towards the queer community within their midst, but it's not being done at an official level. What's coming out of the Vatican, despite what Pope Francis says from time to time, is still not being very disponible. What is being said in the Anglican Church, where I was a priest once, some of the things that we used to say to each other in our synod meetings at a diocesan level were extremely hurtful, and LGBT people were being totally excluded and sidelined and told to go away. You have no place left in the church. If you want to stay, you follow by the rules. So I think it has so this is an argument that was put forward in a period of the Catholic Church in a country, in the Netherlands, 5 to 6 decades ago, where it's almost like an experiment occurred in which mental health was actually adopted by the Catholic Church before it was adopted by the state. Mm. And that is very interesting in itself. And then a priest like Henri Nouwen, who it appears struggled much with his own same-sex attraction because he was very upset by official church teaching in that atmosphere in which he was trained, used these ideas coming out of the Dutch Catholic Church and applied them to same-sex relationships. What's unfortunate is from 1971, when he started to become a famous writer, he stops writing about the subject. Wow, yeah. And he did revisit the subject to some degree many years later during the AIDS pandemic, but he remained nervous about talking about the subject, I believe, because he needed to self-censor if he was going to continue as a spiritual writer. He became one of the biggest spiritual writers in the Catholic Church in the 20th century. And I do know that from interviews that have been that took place after his death, that people said, he often said it was, in the end, this whole issue of same-sex relationships, same-sex attraction within the Catholic Church, the whole debate was in the end not his calling, not his battle. It was for other people to do, because he had a higher calling to write about spirituality in general. But that did not mean that in his early days he wished to tackle the issue, and did it in, I think, an ecclesiastical environment in the Netherlands in which he was free to do so. In the 1970s, unfortunately, the whole atmosphere in the Dutch Catholic Church changed as the Vatican appointed much more conservative bishops to the church in that area, considered to that some of these ideas coming out of the Dutch church were too radical and too liberal.
That's fascinating. Thanks, Philip.
So we might just have time just for one quick question for Philip, if anyone has a question.
Sorry, my answer was too long.
No, that was very informative though. Thanks for that, Philip. Josh, sorry, yes, sorry, was someone speaking? So Joshua had to go, but he said, thanks very much for tracing the history he was unaware of, really heartening and sometimes despairing to hear. Okay. Any questions for Philip? Okay, I mean, I had a question which you kind of answered, Philip, which was about the involvement of the Catholic episcopate at this time, and whether there were any issues with the Vatican. But I mean, I guess
ultimately, I believe there were as the 1960s progressed. Yes,
yeah.
But some of this was taken up in the spirit of the Second Vatican Council, which was calling for reform at the time. But
yeah, and I mean, the fact that they were working with a secular emancipation group as well is very interesting, and must have been very kind of unique, I would say.
unique
presumably.
at the time, yes. It didn't happen in other countries.
Yeah.
Mm.
No.
I was
Okay.
sorry. I was going to. Oh, too late now. Probably. I was interested. I just wasn't sure how to frame the question. I was just interested in this idea of a livable morality and how it played out. At that period. I mean, you've explained what it is, but I just.
The livable morality, I think, the Pastoral Bureau in the end decided, from my understanding, from the research done by Professor Harry Oosterhuis, who went through the archival papers of this institution, was the livable morality was left up to the individual to decide. It wasn't directive about what that looked like, but I suppose it was left up to individual conscience as to how that livable morality, once one accepted their sexual orientation, how that might look, what that might look like. And I think on the whole, you will find in the literature of this time, it was emerging that it was, they would have said at the time, better to live in a same-sex relationship than to live a promiscuous life. It would have been perhaps considered the lesser of two evils because of this image they had of a homosexual underworld and a lot of immoral behavior. If someone could enter into a same-sex relationship, even in the 1960s, that was a better alternative in their view.
So, right.
That
so
would be the livable morality they're probably referring to.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks for that question, Kat. Thanks again, Philip, and thanks, Ika, for your lovely response as well.
Thank you, Ika.
We better move on.